focus tonight is how the idea of going to war was sold to the American people.
Back in January of 1991, the U.S. Congress was voting on whether or not to send American soldiers into war. Just a few months prior, the tiny nation of Kuwait was suddenly invaded by its neighbor Iraq. The American president in power was George H.W. Bush, who claimed that it was America's moral obligation to intervene on Kuwait's behalf. But the American public was torn about whether their soldiers should become involved. The Senate's vote was also tight, with many senators deeply skeptical of the idea. The vote for war still passed, but by only 5 votes. 7 of these senators who voted for war said their vote had been influenced by the testimony of a young Kuwaiti girl. She spoke of the most horrific of atrocities, the mass murder of newborn babies, ripped from their incubators throughout hospitals in Kuwait at the hands of pillaging Iraqi soldiers.
This horrific image captured the imagination of the American public and filled the news cycle for months. But there was one problem.
This story that helped secure the congressional votes for war was a lie.
Part of an elaborate, well-researched,
multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign
to help sell the war to the American people.
The effort to sell the Gulf War was one of the most expensive campaigns launched by a foreign country aimed at manipulating American public opinion in history. And I want to tell you this story because there are hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign influence money being spent every year to influence the US today, led by companies that have learned lessons from this very event. So you need to know how such a campaign could happen, because it will happen again. When the Kuwait government heard that Iraq had launched a surprise attack against them, they knew they were in big trouble. At the time, Iraq had the 4th largest army in the world with 900,000 battle-trained soldiers. In comparison, Kuwait's army was only 20,000. Iraq took over Kuwait in less than a day. Kuwaiti leadership immediately pressed international organizations for help. Both the Arab League and the United Nations condemned Iraq's attack, and the UN hit Iraq with sanctions to put pressure on Iraq to pull out.
But diplomacy and sanctions would have taken time to work, if they worked at all, and the Kuwaiti leadership wasn't willing to wait.
Iraq had already officially annexed Kuwaiti territory, was actively dismantling their government, and was executing their loyalists. So Kuwait's leadership felt that urgent military force was the only answer to get their country back.
That means they would need to find a more powerful country to go in and do the fighting for them.
And the United States was their first choice. But what on earth could convince Americans to spill their own blood and resources for the Kuwaiti cause? Kuwait didn't have a particularly good relationship with the United States. They had voted against the US in nearly every UN resolution. True, they have oil, lots and lots of oil, but of all the sources from which the US imported oil, Kuwait made up only 2% of imports. The US could easily rely on its other partners to make up the difference.
So the US doesn't need Kuwait, and the US doesn't particularly like Kuwait, so the plan of having the US go to war for Kuwait was looking pretty bleak, until a special visitor came calling.
In the United States' capital city of Washington, D.C., Kuwait's embassy is visited by a powerful and influential company named Hill & Knowlton. And their specialty is making sure the interests of their clients become the interests of the United States.
How the heck do they do that?
They combine 2 powerful skill sets under one roof. Their lobbying division focuses on understanding how political leaders think and what they want, so that the lobbyists can motivate these leaders to act in ways that are beneficial to Hill & Knowlton's clients. The Public Relations Division focuses on changing the opinions of the general American population, often by handling and manipulating the media in all of its forms.
The fact that Hill & Knowlton houses both of these specialties means they can launch a campaign that touches every part of American society. And boy, do they get results!
When the Tiananmen Square uprising was crushed on national television, Hill & Knowlton was hired by the Chinese government to ensure that China's favorable trading status with the US wasn't disrupted. They lobbied for the Indonesian government after its state-driven massacre, and cleaned up Turkey's image after its severe government crackdowns. Hill & Knowlton represents more than half of the Fortune 100 companies, and they were certain they could help the Kuwaiti government with their problem.
They had already put together a team of heavy hitters. Here are some of the people they would put on the Kuwait account.
The former director of communications for President Reagan. He helped Reagan get elected twice and has easy access to anyone in the Republican Party. The former press secretary of Robert F. Kennedy and former president of NPR, with connections throughout the American media. the former Pentagon spokesman for the Carter administration with connections throughout the military establishment.
But I've been saving the most insane for last. What if I told you that Hill and Knowlton could offer Kuwait direct access into the White House itself?
When George H.W. Bush was vice president, he had a chief of staff named Craig Fuller. Fuller now works for Hill and Knowlton, but he still maintains a very close relationship with the now president.
In fact, Fuller has been invited to join the president and his staff to discuss the crisis in Kuwait every single week until it's resolved. Do you understand the implications of that?
This means that one of the top execs at Hill and Knowlton, a company that is being paid by Kuwait to get the US to go to war on Kuwait's behalf, would be invited to offer his opinion to the President of the United States every single week. The Kuwaiti leadership didn't need much time to decide. They signed a deal with Hill and Knowlton for $12 million, almost $25 million in today's currency. Now it was just time for Hill and Knowlton to work their magic. Hill and Knowlton has just been paid for one mission: get the United States to use its military power to force Iraq out of Kuwait.
How difficult was this going to be?
Because of their insider connection to the Bush administration, Hill and Knowlton already knows that the president favors military intervention with Iraq. That's because Kuwait's annexation would have doubled Iraq's oil supply, giving Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein control over 20% of the world's oil. Bush feared that this would destabilize global oil markets and make Hussein too powerful.
But going to war for global oil markets wasn't a winning message with the American people nor Congress at the time. And even though technically Bush didn't need permission from either to send over soldiers,
he didn't want to risk a public approval hit if he did so, and therefore Bush wanted Congress to approve a military intervention. So the question became, how can Hill and Knowlton convince a majority of Congress and the American people that the Kuwait government was worth restoring to power?
Research showed that Americans were more willing to go to war to liberate a country if that country was democratic. Uh-oh.
Kuwait has been ruled by a single royal family for their entire modern history.
Yes, they do have a constitution that calls for a national assembly that is elected by their citizens,
but this national assembly can be disbanded at any time by the ruling emir, which he did 4 years prior to Iraq's invasion.
But these facts don't matter if Americans don't know them. And Americans knew so little about the region that a Hill and Knowlton exec described the campaign as disseminating information into a void. And for a PR company, this is the best kind of campaign, because they can say whatever they want without worrying about pushback from preconceived notions.
So the first narrative that Hill and Knowlton would push was framing Kuwait as a developing democracy, under attack by an evil dictator that America had the moral obligation to defend.
But to send out that message, they needed the right messenger.
Americans wouldn't trust some big lobbying PR company, nor Kuwait's royal family.
But what about a grassroots organization with an inspiring name?
Something like
Citizens for a Free Kuwait.
Citizens for a Free Kuwait.
Citizens for a Free Kuwait.
Yep, that should do nicely.
Now, Citizens for a Free Kuwait would be almost entirely funded by the Kuwaiti government and its operations fully organized by Hill and Knowlton. But by creating this front group, all of their messaging could now appear to the press as having originated from a grassroots movement.
What is Citizens for a Free Kuwait?
Citizens for a Free Kuwait is a group of citizens, Kuwaiti citizens, American citizens, anybody who believe in supporting the Kuwaiti people and the human rights of the Kuwaitis.
Hill and Knowlton would use their contacts in the press to connect spokespeople from Citizens for a Free Kuwait to newspaper and magazine journalists, as well as book them on dozens of TV shows to reinforce the democratic narrative.
Kuwait, in the Western sense, is an evolving democracy.
Kuwait in its history has been humanitarian. If I can show the constitution of the state of Kuwait.
One of the most advanced constitutions in the third world.
If democracy had any chance, I think, in the Middle East, it was in a place like Kuwait. And with the occupation of Kuwait, that chance was really destroyed.
This is a good start, but this kind of messaging would only reach the politically active and the intellectual elite, which is important, but Hill and Knowlton also needed to connect with the American masses. And this is where PR really shines.
They'll organize protests throughout the US and across major European cities, making sure they have plenty of merch to hand out and get photographed. They'll target college campuses to harness that youthful activism, hit the American heartland by reaching out to hundreds of influential church leaders to organize prayer days for Kuwait. They'll use their lobbyists to pressure 13 mayors and state governments to declare official Free Kuwait days.
Hill and Knowlton was hitting their messaging hard in the first 2 months, but by October 1990, they realized things weren't going so well.
Part of Hill and Knowlton's job was to collect tons and tons of data, which was harder to do in the 90s pre-internet. They devised all kinds of tests and focus groups to see what kind of messaging was and wasn't working.
Polling was showing that Americans just weren't buying the democracy messaging. And this is a pretty big problem because an anti-war movement was starting to build, so something needed to be done fast before it grew too large. But all was not lost. Americans had changed their mind about something in the last 2 months, and that was Saddam Hussein.
If you had asked Americans a year ago who Saddam Hussein was, most wouldn't have known his name. But since the invasion, Americans had thought of him as one of the most evil men in the world.
So Hill and Knowlton decided they needed to lean into this, but make this feeling translate into action on behalf of Kuwait.
The revised narrative would be Saddam Hussein is a monster, ordering his troops to commit atrocities so heinous that it would be morally wrong for the US not to intervene to stop it. And sadly, there were a lot of atrocities going on in Kuwait at the hands of Iraqi soldiers. But just using Hill and Knowlton's PR team to amplify these atrocities wouldn't be enough.
The horrible truth is, there are terrible atrocities going on across the world at all times.
Just that year alone, there were 10 atrocities on this scale. None of them broke through the American or global consciousness enough to provoke a war of intervention. So the new task for Hill and Knowlton was to find or craft an atrocity story that was novel enough to capture widespread attention and emotionally moving enough to motivate action.
What they did next would change the direction of history and bring the US into war in just 3 months. Let's see how it went down.
Welcome all of you this morning. This is the Congressional Human Rights Caucus hearing on the human rights atrocities in Kuwait.
Today you're going to hear not hearsay evidence, eyewitnesses who have lived through these atrocities by the Iraqi people.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayirah, and I just came out of Kuwait. It's the second week after invasion. I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
After this testimony, everything changes.
We have never dealt with consummate evil run amok as clearly as we are dealing with it this morning.
This footage aired on every major news station.
U.S. Congress held a highly emotional hearing today on atrocities in Kuwait.
And a 15-year-old girl afraid to use her real name in case of reprisals against her family in Kuwait.
It was then picked up by major newspapers across the country. A tape that purported to show even more testimony about the atrocities in Iraq was shown at the congressional hearing and then was distributed to the news media and aired in the coming weeks.
They stole the incubators and threw the babies out of the incubators.
22 newborn babies were in incubators, and the troops, the Iraqi troops, turned off the oxygen.
President Bush would mention it in every major speech he gave.
They had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators.
Kids in incubators thrown out.
Babies pulled from incubators and scattered like firewood across the floor.
A month later, the UN would meet to discuss the atrocities in Kuwait.
The star testimony was from a surgeon who claimed to have seen the baby massacre firsthand.
The hardest thing was burying the babies. I myself buried 40 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators by the soldiers.
2 days later, the UN issued a deadline of January 15th for Iraq to be out of Kuwait, and that the US and its coalition was allowed to use military force if Iraq did not comply. Shortly thereafter, Amnesty International, a well-regarded nonprofit organization that documents human rights violations worldwide, released an 84-page report on the atrocities committed by Iraqi soldiers against the people of Kuwait. The first page leads with the story of 300 premature babies left to die after the stealing of incubators. This report was considered so authoritative that it was written into the congressional record when debating the U.S. reaction to this crisis.
Now is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
7 of the deciding votes for war in the Senate would cite the babies in incubator story as their reasoning for voting for war.
So, shall we see what really happened here?
Let's start with the Nayirah testimony and the environment in which it took place. This looks like an official congressional hearing, doesn't it? It says the word congressional on the background banner, and if you were to cut it together with a congressional hearing, they look pretty similar.
And this is on purpose. It's so the news media would be fooled into saying,
U.S. Congress held a highly emotional hearing today on atrocities in Kuwait.
But this is not an official congressional event.
It was created and overseen by an independent entity called the Human Rights Caucus, led by these two congressmen here.
And the distinction matters in a big way.
You have to be under oath when you testify to Congress. But this independent hearing is not legally binding, and one could lie without consequences.
But there's some other aspects of the Human Rights Caucus that makes their involvement suspicious.
For instance, their headquarters happens to be located in the same building as Hill and Knowlton. Actually, sorry, I misspoke. Hill and Knowlton owns the office building and rents out office space to the Human Rights Caucus for free. Yes, Hill and Knowlton pays the rent for the Human Rights Caucus's office.
The operation of the two are so close that the office's phone calls are funneled to the front desk at Hill and Knowlton.
The vice president of Hill and Knowlton helped organize this particular event and ensured that the press showed up for it. These two senators were later confronted about this, but they would claim that the connection to Hill and Knowlton doesn't represent a conflict of interest. But a month after this event, the Human Rights Caucus would be paid $50,000, that's $100,000 in today's money, in the form of a donation from Citizens for a Free Kuwait.
Hold on, it's gonna get so much worse.
Let's move on to the backstory of the young Kuwaiti girl who was only identified by the name Nayirah.
The caucus claimed that they were keeping her identity hidden in order to protect her family from reprisals, but there were some added benefits to this secrecy.
Nayirah wasn't just any 15-year-old girl, she was a member of the Kuwaiti royal family. In fact, she is the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. Her father was the first speaker of the event.
But this fact was never noted during the hearing to anyone,
and was only discovered by investigative journalists a year later.
It shouldn't surprise you by now, but Hill and Knowlton was heavily involved in her testimony.
Her wardrobe, hair, makeup had all been tested on focus groups to see what would be the most relatable to an American audience. Hill and Knowlton helped her craft the speech and then coached her on how to deliver it, and it was very emotional.
But almost no part of this speech was true.
After the war was over, special investigators found that there was no record of Nayirah having volunteered at a hospital.
These investigators tracked Nayirah down to try to substantiate her story, but by then her story had changed.
She would then admit she hadn't actually been at the hospital, but that a friend who had been there told her about the baby incident.
That's quite a change. Imagine how differently that would have landed in her testimony.
Now, the additional testimonial footage shown at the hearing at the UN and then distributed to the media was all produced by Citizens for a Free Kuwait, filmed by camera teams provided by Hill and Knowlton. And the UN hearing star testimony of the surgeon also unraveled after the war was over. It turns out that he had used a fake name and that he lied about his profession, and he didn't work in the hospital where the baby incident had supposedly happened. He was a dentist who worked for the royal family, and he was also coached and prepped by Hill and Knowlton. But what about the Amnesty International report that covered 300 murdered babies in incubators on their front page?
Well, it turns out that Amnesty International couldn't actually get access to Kuwait after Iraq's invasion.
That's because Saddam Hussein had shut out foreigners from visiting entirely.
So all the reporting on the atrocities in Kuwait had to rely on hearsay from refugees by necessity. Unfortunately, some of these testimonials were supplied by Citizens for a Free Kuwait,
which, unbeknownst to Amnesty International, was connected to Hill and Knowlton and pushing a public relations narrative.
Was there any truth to this baby incubator story at all?
After the war was over, investigators from Middle East Watch, another nonprofit that documents atrocities in the Middle East, went to Kuwait to investigate.
We were able to go around the hospitals to count the incubators and find that, possibly with one or two that had been misplaced, that none were missing. So none of the incubators were moved in the first place, that there weren't any deaths which had been deliberately the cause of the Iraqis having gone in and stolen equipment. The story was a complete hoax.
An investigator from 2020 interviewed the heads of the obstetrics unit in the biggest hospital in Kuwait, and they also contradicted the story.
This is very specific. Iraqi soldiers took them out of the incubators.
No, they didn't took them away from the incubator.
I think it's something just for propaganda.
When Amnesty International was finally able to investigate this on the ground, they ended up retracting their report.
We spoke to well over a dozen doctors of different nationalities who had been in Kuwait at the time, and they couldn't stand the story up, and it became quite clear to us that credible medical opinion was that this didn't happen.
So what we have here is a powerful PR and lobbying company hired by a foreign country to bring the US into war. They created a fake front group to sow empathy with the American public, then fabricated an atrocity story and then spread the narrative to the people through several widely publicized pseudo-events and into the minds of key congressional leaders. The President of the United States, who was meeting weekly with a Hill and Knowlton executive, used his megaphone to reinforce the story to an even wider audience. So just 6 months after being hired, Hill and Knowlton had earned every dollar they were paid.
This story helped me gain a greater appreciation for how powerful foreign influence campaigns can be. It's worth noting that many of these tactics are still being used by public relations and lobbying firms today.
As of this recording, there are now over $600 million spent every year by foreign governments with the explicit goal of manipulating American public opinion or influencing US policy through lobbying.
We know this because foreign governments have to register as foreign agents under the FARA Act whenever they want to participate in either public relations or lobbying campaigns. Part of the reason that we know as much about this story as we do
is because the Kuwait government and Hill and Knowlton registered their activities and disclosed their financial receipts under FARA, and investigative journalists followed the money to piece together the story. But an audit in 2016 by the Department of Justice found that FARA's enforcement is chronically understaffed and underfunded, and the law is full of loopholes. It's estimated that only 40% of foreign influence campaigns are actually registered under FARA. The rest are hidden from public scrutiny, which is a tremendous amount of propaganda money being spent in the shadows.
One of the great underreported debates that's going on in the United States right now is how to reform this system. The entire topic would require its own video to discuss, and if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments. In the meantime, I'll provide some links in the video description if you'd like to dive in further. I hope you found this story insightful. If you would like to support the work I'm doing here so that I can release at a faster pace, consider checking out my Patreon. I've already got some extra content up there, exploring many of the interesting details that I couldn't fit into this episode that I think you'll enjoy. Thank you all for watching, and stay sane out there.